Hi. This video is the second of a three-part series that's intended as a general introduction to the philosophy of existentialism. Whereas the first video focused on how people commonly perceive existentialism, this one will center around exploring some of existentialism's principal themes and ideas. The third video in the series will focus on sketching out existentialism's historical emergence as well as its primary thinkers and texts. Anyhow, I should probably begin this video by making note of a qualifier that I talked about in my last video on existentialism, which is that generalizing about it tends to be difficult because existentialism encompasses a broad and disparate range of thinkers and ideas. So the themes we'll be exploring in this video should be taken as rough and approximate indicators of existential thought, rather than as concepts that figure prominently and obviously in every single existential thinker's work. Since this is an introductory video, hopefully doing that will help you get an overall sense of what existentialism is about. So, with all of that in mind, where to start? Let's take our first clue from a linguistic oddity that sometimes appears in existential texts. Basically, you'll be reading along and all of a sudden the author will start spelling the word existence in strange ways, such as... At first, it looks like a misprint, but then they keep on doing it. So the obvious question is, why? What are they trying to say to us with that? Well, the answer probably has a couple levels to it. At the most obvious and superficial level, they're probably trying to get our attention, and more specifically, to get us to suspect that there may be a lot more to the word existence than we typically think. Basically, they're trying to dislodge us from our usual habit of taking existence for granted and assuming that we already know enough about it so that there's no real need to question its meaning. Which I would say is actually one of the most important overarching themes in the entire existential movement. In this regard, existentialism is about precipitating a moment of awakening in our lives. Awakening to the reality of existence. The existential psychologist Rollo May calls this the I am experience and sees it as central to any form of existential psychotherapy. However, at another level, existentialists are also trying to steer us toward hearing the word existence in a somewhat deeper way than average. Basically, in the etymological sense of the word, which has to do with standing out. But what does it mean to say that existence has to do with a kind of standing out? Well, to exist means to stand out in the world somehow, as well as to stand out with respect to time. In other words, when we say that we exist, what we're really saying is that we are forms of being in the world. So much so that the world we inhabit is integral to what we ourselves are, just as much as what we are is integral to what the world is. To be human is to be caught up in a kind of mad, delirious, and terrifying dance with the entirety of the universe, as each moment of our lives gives way to the next. So, it's not so much that reality is ultimately objective, or ultimately subjective in nature, nor is it merely the simple sum of all objects extended in space and all elements of our subjective experience, as the Enlightenment-era philosopher Descartes described it. What's really going on is that objectivity and subjectivity are actually interrelated aspects or poles of the fundamentally unitary phenomenon of existence as such. The big trick here is to realize that the subjective experiential pole is always seeking meaningful expression in the objective world. For instance, we constantly affect changes in the objective world as a function of our experience of its coherence and meaning, as well as in terms of our projects and desires in relation to it. And at the same time, the objective world is constantly seeking meaningful expression in how we subjectively experience it. For instance, as I'm filming this, it's pretty cold in this room, which enters into my subjective experience in various ways. However, It's that dimension of irreducibly meaningful expression that the additive formula of reality equals objectivity plus subjectivity misses. In this regard, the existentialists are seeking to understand existence in a more fundamental way than the usual dichotomous way we have of thinking about our lives, where what we are on the inside is basically separable from what the world is on the outside. In this regard, the existential view of reality is much more commensurate with an Eastern yin-yang view than with a typical Western view. But why is this important? Why does it really matter how we view reality? Well, for one thing, how we view reality and our place within it has a lot to do with the quality of our lives. For instance, if we see ourselves as more or less separable from the world, then it makes a kind of sense to treat the world and its creatures, which of course would include other human beings, as resources to be consumed and exhausted according to our desires. On the other hand, if we're able to see ourselves as intimately related to the world and to everything alive in it, well, and it makes much more sense to treat everything as something sacred, as worthy of our best and brightest engagement, as something whose well-being vitally matters to our own, and vice versa. So, in this regard, one of the central themes of existentialism has to do with a kind of holism. However, the theme of holism also arises in a different way in existential thought, in its insistence on exploring the darker and more unsettling latitudes of human existence. As I explained in the previous video in this series, existentialists are definitely not shy about exploring things like alienation, anxiety, dread, mindless conformity, our fear of freedom, and to top it off, death. But this too is an expression of the desire to see and live life holistically and also passionately. Of course, sometimes people talk about holism as a way of conjuring a vision of life filled with rainbows and lollipops and unicorns. Basically, only the nice, pleasant aspects of human existence. But from an existential perspective, life is always far more than that. And the impulse to exclude or neglect the dark, horrific sides of life is therefore itself nothing more than a kind of anti-holistic reductionism, a kind of spiritual narcosis. Basically, existentialists aren't interested in participating in the kind of pusillanimous, socially sanctioned charade that would limit us to the nice, polite, and safe parts of life. Their desire is to confront, understand, and embrace all of it, and especially the parts that present us with the greatest challenge, the parts we're eager to regard as ugly, offensive, and inappropriate. Maybe Friedrich Nietzsche captured this thematic best when he famously proclaimed, "The secret of realizing the greatest fruitfulness and enjoyment of existence is to live dangerously. Build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius, sail your ships into uncharted seas, live in conflict with your equals and with yourselves." In this regard, existential works call us toward taking up our existence as a kind of boundless adventure. They beckon us toward the possibility of discovering real courage within ourselves. The courage to look life directly in the face without flinching. The courage to live our lives with integrity, exhilaration, and verve. Because it takes that kind of courage to see that we live out our fragile, unpredictably transient lives suspended over an infinite abyss. It takes a very personal form of bravery to face the fact that we've been cast into this life with no real idea of where we came from or where we're going, or even if there's a point to it at all. It also takes daring and vision to glimpse how far our fundamental freedom and responsibility really run, and yet how eager we are to disown them and to live according to our world's prevailing logic of conformity, obedience, and excuses. It takes a deep and abiding sense of adventure to seize the reins of our lives with our own hands and to lay claim to all of the possibilities and potentialities that are most uniquely ours. And perhaps most of all, it takes a strange and paradoxical form of courage to recognize how often we're ruled by our fears and our limiting beliefs. And then even more courage to learn how to live beyond them. And it seems to me that all of this is important not only for its own sake and not only for the sake of our souls, but because our world invites and coerces us into doing the exact opposite of that most of the time. In my view, we live in a historical period where our world's prevailing logic constantly tells us that we need to be pointing fingers and blaming others for our difficulties. That is, for the most part, we live in an era of excuses. In an age of feckless bellyaching and existential disempowerment, where we've lost our sense for the true depth and power of our being. So, in this regard, it seems to me that existentialism provides a kind of counterweight and corrective to some of the prevailing pathologies of our time. However, this brings us to another recurrent theme in existentialism, that of freedom and responsibility. A motif perhaps explored most thoroughly by the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre. Generally speaking, for existentialists, the main variable in the complex equation that determines the quality of our lives has to do with our decisions and our willingness to assume responsibility for ourselves. With whether I decide to be in a good mood today, for instance, or whether I decide to pay my bills or not. Of course, there are also inevitably many aspects of our lives that we did not choose. However, even there, we're still free to choose the meaning and significance of those parts of our lives, which in turn will shape how we actually experience them. For instance, personally, I seemingly didn't choose to be born into a male Caucasian body in the year 1960 to Gilbert and Ellen Dodson. Nevertheless, how I take up all of that and what I do or do not do with it is completely a function of my ongoing choices. My choice of projects, where I direct my energies and attention, my choice of moods, attitudes, meanings, values, etc., etc. And it all crystallizes in something as immediate and as palpable as whether I try to make a good video for you. And whether I try to extend myself toward the further reaches of who I am, intellectually, emotionally, and creatively for you right now. As Sartre once put it, freedom is what you do with what's been done to you. However, existentialists also generally aver that the main thing that we do with our freedom and responsibility is run from it. Mostly by pretending that X, Y, or Z is determining us and forcing us to feel or to be as we are. Or by simply making petty excuses for ourselves. A pair of freedom-denying tactics that Sartre calls bad faith. And the same basic thing is true of our deeper possibilities in life more generally. The sad truth is that for the most part, we usually run from anything that seems powerful and luminous in ourselves. For Martin Heidegger, we human beings have the chance to exist authentically, but we usually just imitate and obey the anonymous herd instead. For Martin Buber, we have the chance to address each other as a sacred thou, but we mostly objectify and manipulate each other instead. For Soren Kierkegaard, we have the chance to live in a passionate and committed relation with God, but we mostly just obey the dictates of pleasure and pain, or perhaps those of secular ethics instead. In other words, existentialists often point out how easy and common it is for us to fall short of our deeper destinies in life. And I suppose that on one hand, all of that can seem pretty depressing. But we could just as easily take it as a kind of challenge, as existentialism's way of daring us to make the most of our fundamental freedom and responsibility, to make it a real, palpable force in our lives. Or, in the spirit of Martin Heidegger, we could see it as an occasion to lay claim to our own most potentiality for being. Or, as Buber would have it, to learn to say a sacred vow to the beings around us and to enter into relation with them. You get the idea. But here we encounter another big theme in existentialism, that of change, of transcending our habits and ourselves. This is why, of all of the philosophers of classical antiquity, the one that existentialists have the greatest affinity for would probably be Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher who saw fire as the most fundamental of the ancient elements and evolved a philosophy of change and metamorphosis out of that insight. And here is where the existential themes of holism, adventure, and freedom come together. After all, what is the point of all of that, if not to pass beyond our already existing horizons and to participate more fully in the processes of universal transcendence? To play our part in how the universe is giving birth to something beyond itself and struggling to become more conscious of itself through our own expanding awareness. And when you think about it, what adventure could possibly be deeper than that? What better use for our existential freedom could there possibly be than that? To change the universe as we change ourselves. To make our lives ever more beautiful, ever more powerful, becoming ever more like stars glittering in the midnight of an incalculable sky, moment by moment, more like a boundless poem inscribed in blood, flesh, and time in the living pages of the world. What human destiny could be greater than that one? And here we arrive at yet another existential theme, that of art and creativity, which, if you think about it, is itself nothing more than a mode of change and transcendence. In this arena, Friedrich Nietzsche once famously held that it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are eternally justified. And perhaps so too with our lives. Similarly, against the backdrop of the directionlessness of our fundamental freedom, Sartre's exhortation is for us to become the artists of our lives. And so existentialism's call is really twofold. On one hand, it tries to awaken us to the reality we're inhabiting in all of its wonder and all of its terror. But it also calls us to begin living as though we were creating a work of art, with all of the daring, passion, and soul that great art possesses. But to do that means that we need to come to grips with and ultimately live out the great creative potential and challenge of being human. And so the existential question is, can we find it in ourselves, at least now and then, to let go of the tedious routines and habits that have trammeled us, perhaps for many years, and face the brilliant, spontaneous dawn of a new kind of life, yearning to be born in and through us? Can we find it in ourselves to be deeply creative with our lives and not merely cogs in some well-oiled machine? For existentialists, this is not a trivial or inconsequential question. In fact, it's probably the human question par excellence. And this brings us to the last major theme I'd like to examine in this video, that of passion and its relation to reason. As may have been evident at certain points in this video, existentialists easily affirm the power and value of the passions. It's not that they're anti-rationalists in principle, as is sometimes claimed. They only appear to be that way from a perspective that would see value only in reason and in little else outside of reason. In reality, existentialists are, in a sense, extra-rational. What I mean by that is that existentialists seek to lay claim to all that is human, to honor and embrace our capacity for reason, but no more than our capacity for passion. That's because, from an existential perspective, the point of life is not to be as rational and as defensively correct as possible. That's just the kind of game we sometimes play. The real point is to drink in the broad river of human experience, to take in all that is dark and all that is bright, all that is orderly and all that is chaotic, all that is just and all that is unjust, to exclude nothing, to censor nothing, to demote and dishonor nothing, to hold it all in our hearts as well as in our minds. And, well, like I said earlier, what better adventure could there possibly be than that? What better way of spending our time in this life? Okay, that's all. Enjoy the day. Peace out.